Hey, good morning, afternoon, or evening, good people, wherever you are, wherever you happen to be, and however we're together. Thanks for being here. I'm Dave, and this is Dave's Head. So, what's in my head? Well, this past weekend, I had a nice, enjoyable, long, extended weekend, a 4-day weekend. Flew down to Charlotte on Thursday. Relatively uneventful. Flight was a little delayed coming in, so flight going out was a little delayed, but nothing crazy. Nice little late morning or early afternoon, actually. Flight landed in Charlotte safely, had a good time, but got to visit some new family. My Tio's brother and nephews all live down there, so got to check them out. Ironically, it's a small world because I had actually met my Tio's brother unofficially, not in person, many, many years ago because we are both in the same Facebook group talking trash about sports. And so we got to know each other through that Facebook group and finally got to meet in person. But it shows you just how small this world is and how small social media technology has made this world where you can actually know someone and even know a lot about a person before you actually meet them in person. To kind of, think about online dating, right? I mean, it's kind of how online dating works, although not the same in this case for obvious reasons. But got to meet some fam, have a good time, relax. Slept a lot on Thursday when I got there, which for me always kind of ruins my sleep because I'll be up half the night and then kind of off the clock, if you will. But everything worked out. Had a great weekend. But one thing about the Charlotte area is the food, right? Heavy food. And I've notably gotten away from my workout regime, partly because of retiring from football, partly because I'm being so busy in my daily life, and partly just the comfort of my daily routine, right? They say 21 days makes for a routine. I think that's still true. Or I think I heard yesterday, actually, 7 times of seeing something creates a pattern. Well, 7 days of not working out the way I used to, or 21 days straight, however you want to look at it, has created a scenario where I don't work out. I don't wake up first thing in the morning. It used to be first thing in the morning, I wake up, get my workout in. As soon as my feet hit the bed, I go to the bathroom because I pee like a camel every morning. But fun fact you absolutely didn't need to know. But feet would touch the ground. I get my workout in, have my smoothie and my tea, start my day. That was kind of my routine I started during COVID because one, you're stuck in a house for X number of days or months, whatever it was. And I wanted to make sure I maintained my physical fitness for when life returned to normal. But also, it was an opportunity to kind of reset health and reset working out and reset getting back to really what I was doing as a late teen, early young adult. And so, I've talked about thoughts of relocating in the past, and one of the locations was the Charlotte area. It's bustling with new transplants. It's a tech hub. If you're into that technology type of work style or even just technology in general. But it has a vibe that resembles a lot of what Philly represents in some cases. I think minus the incredible violence at some point. But it's also got this southern food vibe, right? Which would be challenging for my comfortable existence that I have because, since I retired, I've eaten healthy, I'll eat unhealthy. I'll work out in spurts, I won't work out in spurts. I'll golf, which obviously burns a lot of calories. Every once in a while, I'll go for walks, I'll go for running. But the challenge of, I think, would be living down in the Charlotte area, which is a good northern comfy feel, but southern food dynamic as well, is that it feels like everything is heavy. Even tacos feel heavy. And so I'm notorious about weighing myself. Probably every other morning I weigh myself. I'll weigh myself before I go to the bathroom. I'll weigh myself after I go to the bathroom to get my true weight. At least in my head, after I go to the bathroom is my true weight. But I feel like it would be a challenge to maintain a certain closeness to the standard that I'm used to having living in the South because of the heaviness of everything. Now, don't get me wrong. There are some amazing flavors in the South, some amazing flavors in the Charlotte area, some great food I've had every single time I go into Charlotte, every single time without fail. But it would absolutely 100% be a challenge to maintain a certain standard of physical fitness especially if you're eating out. Now, if you're cooking a lot at home, if that was the move to Charlotte and I'm cooking out at home a lot, then I think, you have a lot more control over what you eat. But, you're hanging out with friends, you're hanging out with family, you're going out, dates and all these things, and you're ordering food that's heavy. I'm talking like I'm getting full and I haven't gotten to the entree yet. Heavy. That could be a challenge. But an amazing weekend. And it was just, it was a great time. Great to meet new fam. Great to have conversations in person. So another great experience with my TO, wherever the path takes us, right? The next thing that's on my mind is when this episode drops, we are thankfully, and I mean thankfully, less than 2 weeks away from this election being over. Now, what follows is something that only accurate fortune tellers can know. I don't know who's going to win. I don't know who's going to lose. I don't know how fanboys and cult members and followers and, all the dynamics that exist in politics today, what the reaction of those people are going to be. But who wins, who loses, we'll know by the next episode. And we'll know the aftermath as well. But as usual, I am 100% fully, completely over it. I'm sick of the commercials that border. I mean, some of these commercials just border on comedy. Like there are times I struggle with seeing some of these commercials and realizing that there are people in this country who actually will look at these commercials and take them seriously. I mean, it reminds me of like comedy night in a hole in the wall, right? Like there are people who go there for the cheap drinks, the cheap food, the cheap comedy, and will find this incredibly comedic, funny, real. And that's how I look at some of these commercials. Some of these commercials are so obviously just not true, not based in reality, but they cater to a certain base. They cater to people who want to believe this stuff. And even the stunts, like just things, everything about this election and many elections for a while now border on just lunacy. The fact that people actually gobble this stuff up and determine who they're going to vote for based on the things they see on the screen that they do zero research on, but find compelling enough to persuade them to vote for someone. But I think I've had enough moments, but I think my I had enough moment came this Sunday, ironically, on the way back from Charlotte. Let me break this down for you real quick. We arrived at the airport just fine, filled up the rental on the way, dropped it off. We got through security just fine, although I will say, side note, the x-ray technician, scanner guy, whatever his title is, thought he was scanning for people getting into the Pentagon or something. I mean, he just took so long to look at that little screen or screens that they have there, the guy sitting there on the chair. It got borderline annoying. Just like, come on, dude. Just stop. But anyway, found a seat at the bar, watched the game that was on, but also watched some highlights on the Red Zone channel on my iPad, and I had my phone going with my updates on one of my apps that could give me play-by-play of the Eagles game. Pretty cool. Got some good food, got to our gate without issue. Our plane was slightly late getting in, which happened on the way down, happened on the way back. Nothing crazy. But what really irked me, and really just put me over the top on I'm over this election stuff, is we managed to board. We pushed back from the gate. We, what is it called? Cruising. It's called something else. Taxi. We taxi on the runway. And all of a sudden we stop. And I'm sitting on the window of the plane. So I look to the right, and there's American Airlines plane to the right. And they're just stopped. And then I happen to just kind of get really close to the glass, and I can see other planes behind that plane. I can't see behind us, but I can see behind that plane. They're stopped. And then the captain comes on and says, essentially, hey, we got a ground stop. Flights into Philly are being delayed because of a VIP. I think that was the term he used. And then he goes on to say, usually when this happens, it's either the president or the vice president. And I'm like, okay. Wasn't aware of something happening in Philly, but that's what it is. And then we sit there for about an hour. and it might have been over an hour. It was a long time. I got through watching a whole bunch of games and stuff on my iPad while we were waiting. And then we finally take off. Cool. We're late, but whatever. It's still afternoon, and we're supposed to get back like 4 o'clock ish in the afternoon. We take off, cruising just fine, and all of a sudden, now I've flown enough times where I can feel, and some people can feel this, some people can't, but I feel the plane slow down. And then I feel a nice little bank. I'm like, okay, we're turning. Because usually, sometimes when you're flying south, they'll take you up the coast and into Jersey, and you'll come back west direction and land in Philly. Happens all the time. I'm figuring, it's about that time. We're getting close to Philly. We're banking and we're making that turn, and we're making an announcement we're landing soon. Pilot comes on and says, just got word. We're delayed going into Philly again because of the priority blocking, whatever the term was he used. We're going to circle Baltimore. We're going to circle Baltimore. And we'll let you know when this is all over. And again, he says, sorry, folks, nothing we could do. This is usually something that happens when the president or the vice president, Secret Service, blocks off the airway. Nobody can fly in or fly out. Cool. Long story short, turns out we're 3 hours late getting into Philly because of a stunt that clown wanted to play. He wanted to put on a show at a McDonald's. He closed the McDonald's, had hired people go through the drive-thru, pretended to serve them food, and this made a bunch of people late. I know people who flew from Florida who were late. We were 3 hours late getting home. So it made which should have been a very short wake up, get to the airport, have some food, board a plane, land, get home, still in time to enjoy the afternoon, even watch the afternoon games if you wanted to, sit out on the deck, get some sun, watch the sunset. Made all that not possible. Did get a nice view of the sunset from my plane, which was nice, not gonna lie. An unplanned benefit, but it was 3 hours late getting home. Not sure if you knew this. And I apologize for what I'm about to say. Some ass kisser in North Carolina the other day actually gave this guy a pin, a Fry certification pin or something like that, when he popped back into North Carolina. And I come back to, I can't believe this is the reality of what's going on in politics. These are the people who are running to be the leader, the top dog, if you will, for the United States of America. And we're doing fake stunts at McDonald's. And the reason behind that is because the opponent, Kamala Harris, the vice president, said that she worked at McDonald's a long time ago. And in order to, I'm not even sure what the point or purpose was, disprove McDonald's, say it wasn't that hard. I don't understand what the purpose and point of this was, but it appears that the result was doing a fake workday at a McDonald's. And this is something that means you're electable, apparently. I look at, and I'll say his name, I look at Trump as if Bernie Madoff, Pat Robertson, George Santos, and your creepy relative all got together and made the worst baby possible. And if you have no idea who those people are, look them up. Bernie Madoff, big con artist, pyramid scheme, all that stuff that he did. Pat Robinson, the evangelical con artist, right? George Santos, the political con artist, if you will. And your creepy relative is the guy, if you're familiar with that really bad joke, he's the creepy relative is the one who gets drunk and inappropriately touches people or says weird things. If all four of those people got together and had a baby in some alternate universe, that's who Donald Trump is. But there are people who subscribe to that baby, subscribe to the things that baby does, the con artist, just all of it. And this, for me, besides making me 3 hours late getting home, which again, annoying. But this whole stunt, that there is a segment of people in this country who are going to celebrate it as something profound, as something that says, yes, this is why I'm going to vote for this person. Who actually say this is me taking this person seriously because they did this, is just bananas to me. Makes no sense. I don't get it. I don't understand how this is our reality. We're the quote unquote greatest country on earth, and the top two people who are vying for the number one office in this land are Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And I'm not even saying Kamala's bad. He's terrible. Is Kamala perfect? No. But he's just horrible. Personality, policy, and listen, we can have a whole show about all the specifics. I do a ton of research, but factual research, not, media research, actual documentation research. But we can do a whole episode about that. Maybe we will, who knows? But this is the reality that we have in this country for a long time now. Our choices have been limited to political characters, right? Instead of policymakers, instead of people who will do for the people and prioritize the people in this country. And there is hope that we can get back to what was the intention of President Obama back in 2008. But, and a whole other topic again, a lot of that intent was stonewalled by the opposition party. What happened Sunday is a microcosm of where we are politically in this country, and frankly, the laughing stock status that we have around the world. If you go outside the country and talk to people outside this country, they are astounded and just, it's comedy to them that this is what our politics are. Talk to people outside the country who observe from afar. They'll tell you that as well. What's in My Head is sponsored by Adapt to Adopt. Adapt to Adopt provides recreational support to adopted children and youth through recreational support groups, mentoring programs, sports and community service projects, and more. For more information, visit rebrand.ly/DHPA2A. That's rebrand.ly/DHPA2A. The last thing that's on my mind is resourcefulness. Now, if you look it up in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, the definition is able to meet situations, capable of devising ways and means. Why is this on my mind? This year has been a steady increase of responsibility and workload for almost every leadership position, organization, things that I currently occupy, even personally. Cohabitating with someone, it takes a level of resourcefulness to cohabitate with someone, compromising in areas and growing in ways that you didn't know that you needed to. For example, you might be used to things sitting in a certain way and your partner is used to them sitting in a different way. Well, you could just simply go back every single day and change and do that, or you can compromise and say, this particular thing is not that serious of a change to make. There's nothing wrong with it. And so that's the way it is. Or you could have a conversation and instead of being ABC and they like CBA, maybe you go BCA. I don't know. But that takes resourcefulness. It takes the ability to meet that situation and devise ways and means to work through it. One thing I've always prided myself on is the ability to, and I've worn it as a badge of honor at many times, is wearing many hats, excelling despite the circumstances each of the different hats presents, and learning from it so that I minimize the negative side of things from wearing those hats or being in those situations. And so, again, professionally, personally, organizations I'm a part of all pose challenges in different levels and different ways this year, and they've increased as the year has gone on. And somebody the other day gave me a call. Rarely happens. I don't talk on the phone that much. But somebody gave me a call, and out loud, the first thing I said was, I need a vacation. Their response was, dude, I don't know how you do all this stuff. And it always puts it in perspective when people see but don't really say observations or acknowledge the level of things that you're doing. And that tantamounted to a level of acknowledgement that I see all the stuff you're doing. I see the struggles you're dealing with, but you're handling them well. Professionally, I was on a call about a month and a half ago, and the call had started. Only myself and somebody else was on the call. The other parties hadn't joined yet. And somebody said to me, hey, I just want to take time out and let you know you are handling all this masterfully. And there's a big change that's happened professionally with me, which has gotten me a lot more responsibility, a lot more business. My calendar looks like a checkers puzzle with all the squares filled in. But it's one thing to pride yourself on being able to wear these hats and be successful and handle circumstances, but you've got to be able to come up with repetitive and repeated things that you can do to mitigate situations as soon as you see them. You got to learn from them. You got to be able to adapt to slight nuances in the different situations in order to be successful handling them. Because otherwise, if you simply handle every situation as it comes and learn nothing from it, learn nothing from anything, then every single time you get a situation presented to you, it'll appear brand new and you'll have to figure it all out again. Point being is, one thing I've learned as someone who's entrenched in technology, been in technology for feels like my entire life, and probably really much so, since I was taking apart my mom's 8-track player back in the 70s and 80s, is that technology and tools exist to make your life and your job easier. Whether it's AI, productivity tools, templates, or if it's you simply defining those repetitive processes, it's important really to establish methods and utilize repeatability in your efforts, in your desire to be more efficient and effective, in order to get into these situations and get out of them just as fast. And one thing I've noticed is that my reliance on technology this year has kind of ramped up a little bit. AI, productivity tools, time tracking tools, task tracking tools, the ability to organize and group the different segments of my responsibility literally in my browser. I'll give you a little tidbit. If you didn't know this, in Google Chrome, you can actually create tabs that will persist past sessions and even on different machines. So if you have a desktop and you create a tab, you log into your account, obviously. If you go to your laptop, you log into your account, those tabs will persist in those groups. And so all you have to do is open the group and every single tab will open up and refresh. And so what I found is tabbing and grouping things in my browser, whether it's email, whether it's tools that I use, whether it's notes that I take, they persist across the different organizations and the roles and responsibilities that I have. And it makes my job so much easier. I don't have to remember literally the 15 different things that I can access within an hour because they're all grouped and tabbed up. Same thing with AI. The different articles I've written, different emails I'm sending, even sometimes curbing my own responses, put it in Chat GPT or some AI tool and say, hey, why don't you make this a little nicer for me? Now, I'm generally nice with my commentary, but sometimes I need a little coaching, if you will, because in that moment, I'm not trying to be nice, but I'm trying to tell somebody go bugger off or whatever without saying go bugger off. And so being resourceful is not just about your internal energy, your ability to adapt, your ability to handle things, to push through. It's not about the crawl up the hill when you could walk. It's not about any of those things. It's about everything besides that, the tools you can use, the processes you can create, the people you can rely on to assist as well. Sometimes you need to just say, I need help. And so being resourceful, again, able to meet situations, capable of devising ways and means, is a broad definition for all the things that you can do to make your life easier. Because nobody wants to work 50-hour weeks or 60-hour weeks. And so if you can come up with processes and tools that you can use, people you can rely on, and so much more to mitigate the issues and reduce the amount of time you're actually doing work, that's better for you. It'll give you more time to do things like working out, to get the heavy foods from Charlotte out of your system. It'll give you time to spend with your family. It'll give you time to find mental peace at the end of your day. There are many times I find myself in the office at 10, 11 o'clock at night. That's not ideal. And so every single time that happens, I try to figure out, well, why was I in there so long? Or what can I do about it? And sometimes it is out of my control. Sometimes it's just the way the day flows. But that's not the ideal state, to be in the office every day, 10, 11 o'clock at night. And so even I, every single day, I'm fine tuning how I handle the many hats that I wear so that I can minimize the amount of time I'm actually doing work, spending in the office, away from my TO, away from my family and friends, away from just my couch, relaxing. It's football season. Kick your feet up, watch some football. But that's what's in my head. So the website OnClusive, think exclusive, but just onclusive.com, has a article entitled "The Power of Media: How Traditional and Social Media Influence the U.S. Electorate." It's from actually March of this year. And they say traditional and social media play a significant role in influencing and impacting the U.S. electorate in various ways. Together, these two mediums shape the political landscape, informing, persuading, and mobilizing voters. A couple things they talk about. The primary influence of traditional media is the ability to, quote unquote, set the agenda. The public discussion is shaped by which stories are put forth and which topics receive the most coverage. You think about back in the 80s, 90s, when our grandmothers were watching the news, from 6 o'clock, they're in front of the 6 ABC or whatever their world news tonight is of their choice. And that drives the whole conversation on family reunions and their weekends with the Avon ladies and all that stuff, right? So the primary influence is setting that agenda, what we talk about, what we think about, for those who actually watch TV media. Now, social media's most powerful influence or feature, they say, is the ability to disseminate information rapidly, allowing users to share and amplify content and any related narratives. When you introduce social media, now you have everybody who's a journalist, right? Everybody's setting the agenda. Everybody's pushing out what they want to, whatever pace or not integrity, influence or excitement level they want to. Now, when you compare the two, they say social media allows users to challenge the traditional narrative and influence how traditional media responds. You think about feedback. You think about how many times you see a news broadcast that has a blurb of somebody's Twitter or X comment, and they respond directly to it. It can also shift, they say, the voter's perspective from a narrative traditional media has presented. Now, a few stats I found kind of interesting that they quoted in this article. So as of 2022, there were 168.42 million registered voters in the United States. Good number, right? Seems like a lot. But according to Pew Research, in 2020, the presidential election had the highest voter turnout of the 21st century, with 66.8% of the eligible voting population casting a vote. Now, I personally think 66% is extremely low. I think there's got to be a reason why we don't get closer to the 80s, 85, why not even 90% participation. 2/3 seems, like 2/3 of people controlling, or 1/3 don't care. I don't know. But it seems like a really low number to me. Now, what's interesting enough is they say nearly 90% of all Americans are active users on social media, which is different. Social media, voting. Social media, voting. I don't know. I don't get it. According to Pew Research as well, they say when asked which of these platforms they prefer to get news from, about half of Americans say they prefer a digital service, which is 53%, compared to TV, 33%. Even fewer say they prefer radio at 7%, or print, 5%. Now, shouldn't be a surprise, those last two, print and radio, dying, dinosaurs. Not a lot of people are going to get their paper at the stand every morning like they used to. But think of it this way: among digital platforms, news websites or apps are the most preferred source for news. About a quarter of U.S. adults, they say 23%, prefer to get their news that way. So digital platforms, news websites. Compare with 13% who say the social media is their source of news, 12% who say they search, and 4% who say prefer podcasts, which, hello, why not podcasts? We know stuff too. The scary thing to me, though, in those stats is that only 12%, think about the numbers, 23% from news websites, 13% social media, 12% are people who actually do their own research, essentially. So they take their information from social media or the news or their friends and family and don't do research, essentially what that's saying. And so for me, that's kind of the scary thing, because it means everybody, at least 88%, are easily influenced by everything except their own research. Kind of scary. But I'm talking about that because of a great guest I have this episode. His name is David Beckemeyer. And so a little bit about him. He is the host of the Outrage Overload Podcast. Say that 3 times, which explores the impact of toxic polarization and outrage-driven media. He was a founding CTO of Earthlink. If you remember that, I'm an old head, so I remember Earthlink, where he helped democratize internet access. Today, he focuses on the intersection of media, technology, and human behavior to foster understanding in an increasingly divided world. What I love about this is his work dives into the psychological and social impacts of our modern media landscape, offering insights on how we can better navigate a world fueled by division and outrage. Welcome to Dave's Head. David, how's it going?
It's going great, Dave. Good to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, I love the name, of course, very biblical and just regal in its historical content. So our mothers thought very highly of us, apparently.
Yeah.
But as I always do, my guests, I know I gave you an introduction there, but it's always better in the guest's own words. So if you could take a moment to tell the people who you are, what you do, and what you're about.
Yeah. So I'll do the short version since it's been around for a while. What do they call I'm seasoned. Is that what they say now? Um, so yeah. So I was a tech in the tech industry for a long time. I kind of worked my way up from line developer and doing software and things like that on up to executive, uh, tech executive, and ultimately working in investment, in tech investment. And I retired from that a few years ago and um, found myself in the middle of this same thing you talked about with the outrage everywhere, um, and that kind of got things heated up. And I thought, well, I'm a curious guy. I'm not really a scientist per se, but I'm a science geek, and I think there's probably a lot of people like me out there that would like to understand a little bit more about what's going on in this environment and maybe what are some of the things we can do about it both personally and then maybe in some larger scale as well. And that's, you talk about this outrage, it was like this circling, people disconnecting and losing friendships, and they don't talk to Uncle Joe anymore, and just this build up of more and more in that. And it seemed like we're losing important relationships over politics. And why is that? And that's kind of what started all this.
Okay. So let's talk about outrage culture, right? What have you learned about it? Where did and really I like to trace in my head I trace this back to mid 2000s when it seemed like this really started to bubble up. But I'm curious what you've learned about it. Where did it start from, and where is it now?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can put it in depending on how you kind of define it. You could say that people have been sort of using this outrage type media probably for as long as people have been communicating, right? And as long as there's been people that sort of want to get on a soapbox and say something. Um, if you talk to the folks that sort of have really looked at the toxic polarization situation we're in now, they sort of it's like a culmination of things going back maybe 60 years. And I do think there's some stair steps along that way, right? You have some changes in the media landscape, right? You have this, you talked a little bit in the intro about there's now this kind of broad, very high diversity of content sources that wasn't there before, for better or worse. I mean, you can never go back and put that genie in the bottle kind of thing. But, you, a lot of people harken back to like, oh, the 70s or whatever, when you kind of had, the Walter Cronkite thing and only three news networks and everybody got that same view of the world. And that was actually sort of an aberration that like wasn't normal. We had partisan news and partisan information for a long time. In fact, that was the norm, that you had very highly partisan stuff. And a lot of towns would have like two really partisan newspapers in that town. And it would be kind of a constant debate or whatever between the two. So that's not new. But you did see did begin to see a shift in, you actually can look at some of the history on this, that is back in the 60s, 60s and 70s. You saw the parties actually decided to start polarizing on issues. In other words, started to try to differentiate themselves because they were getting feedback from voters saying, I can't tell you two apart. Like the two parties are too much alike. So they actually tried to get more different so voters could, I guess, um, you know, do that. They'd stop complaining about that. And that started to create some of the issue polarization where certain kinds of things got dumped in kind of one bucket or the other, and they'd kind of start picking and choosing to fit a demographic that they were looking for. And folks, and that started to polarize more along this kind of liberal. again, a lot of these binary definitions are broken to begin with. It's like a bad model, but it's kind of the world we live in. So kind of liberal conservative. And it used to be there were more conservatives in the Democratic Party and there were more liberals or at least moderates in the Republican Party. And you have less of that now, right? Like it's hardly ever a liberal in a Republican Party, that kind of thing. So you started to see more of that where we started to separate that way. And yeah, and then this media landscape changed. And so some of it was like intentional, like people were trying to create some polarization, and other parts just kind of fell out from all these changes. And and then I think another big step along that way was this idea that and I would put it back to the early 90s, and I think Newt Gingrich was kind of one of the early adopters of this idea that we're going to start demonizing the other side more. And it probably didn't really start with him, but I think he was a big catalyst for it and pushed it on. One of the early ones that was really pushing that. And that kind of started in the early 90s, where the new messaging became a lot about demonizing the other side. And, you know, and both sides do it now, right? It's like nonstop that both sides demonize the other side. So you can't say one side is worse at this than the other. If you get political emails or political texts, I mean, it's almost always just telling me something terrible. The person on the other side is awful. So that began to happen, and then you throw in social media, like you say, kind of these early 2000s, or a little bit later than that for social media. But you start to get more online things and more alternative sources, and now you just get this world where it's much easier to go into your bubble. It's much easier to uh, um, stay in that bubble and really isolate yourself, where you kind of get very unused to you're very uncomfortable if anybody says anything that's not in the normal stuff that your group always says. And so you don't ever have to deal with those conversations, and that's why we find ourselves like throwing people out of our group all the time, because they say one thing that doesn't fit, and you end up with this outrage culture, you end up with this cancel culture kind of idea. And and this brings out a lot of our kind of innate tribal psychology. And so that's been a big trend there, and I think social media comes along and just exacerbates that even more. It does get information out quickly, but it doesn't necessarily make us more connected. um, and I think our brains are not able to really figure out social media. This thing came along, social media. We didn't really have, like, nobody thought about how should we do this. Maybe we should think about how human psychology works. But no, we just kind of threw it on people, and we still really haven't figured out, our human brains haven't really figured out how to deal with this. Is a new kind of communication where you can have this massive bunch of people in a room together, effectively. And that's just not a thing that is anything that our brains are used to.
Yeah, and I'm a little bit younger, I suspect, and so my political existence, if you will, or experience, if you will, really began with the 2000 election. That was really the first time I voted. That was the first time I had any experience with voting and the run up to voting and elections and all that. So for me, even though there was controversy around 2000 with the final tally and it going to the Supreme Court, which they followed the process for the most part, I didn't really see this outrage culture really manifest itself until we got towards the end of Bush's term and before Obama came in. And then it's just, for me, my experience, it's just been you know daggers, 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 and to the point where it's really hard to even tell, as someone who I've worked in data for 25 years. It's data is ones and zeros to me. It's truthful or it's not. It's really hard to exist in this media culture where you really don't know unless you do your own research, whether what's coming through the TV or the radio or posting on social media is true or not. And so, talking about the impacts of TV media, like I said, there's sources that I'll entertain, right? I'll at least get the starting point for my own research, and there's sources I don't trust them. Period. How do we get, or why should we, I should say, trust any media? And I'm talking about conventional media, TV media. Why should we trust any of these major news networks anymore? I mean, they're all so left, right, not exactly true. We're entertainers. We're not news. If you look at the underlining descriptions of some of these media outlets, they're not news networks. They're entertainment networks. And so, why should we trust any of them? And just I'm putting a blanket over all of them. Why should we trust any of them to give us factual information we can use?
Well, if you're specifically talking about TV, um, you know, this is a big challenge because certainly the 24-hour channels have done that same kind of segmentation where they've kind of decided to be partisan one side or the other for the most part. CNN has tried experiments to try to be more neutral or a little bit more moderate. It's like the first guy that sort of tried it, and I don't even know if he did a very good job at it, but didn't last long. So it's still hard to say if there's a market for that, right? I mean, CNN suffering trying to get a market. I think the nightly news on our normal station is still pretty good. I mean, but they're not going into a lot of depth on those shows. I think something like 60 Minutes is still pretty good. I mean, none of this stuff is going to be perfect. I think if you go to NPR again, like they're going to have sometimes they're going to have cases, and that's the challenge that even the best organization sometimes does a bad story. Maybe it was deadlines, maybe it was something else. It's not always nefarious. It could just be the realities of journalism. But TV news is definitely a bit of a challenge because of all those things. So everything has to be seen with sort of a lens of they're probably trying to create a narrative more than give me information. Um, and that's something you just have to go in with that lens. And there might be information there, but just be advised, they're probably leaving some stuff out. That's probably the biggest thing to think about. There's probably another little bit more information about this, more nuance, more complexity. And that's true at TV in general, just because they only have so long usually. And this is why podcasts sometimes people do turn to podcasts because we can dive deeper. We can do 20 minutes on a thing instead of 2 minutes. And so you see that there is a demand for that kind of thing. So you see some of that. But yeah, so TV is a bit of a challenge there. But in general, the news media is a challenge in general as well. I will say there's more good journalism today than there's ever been in history, but there's also a lot of bad journalism and a lot of bad sources and bad information. That's what is the heavy lift for average people. It's too much of a heavy lift. There's no one place I can send you to say, you're going to get all the news and it's going to be the best news. I mean, I would, avoid MSNBC and Fox if you don't want that feedback, or if you don't want, the more partisan stuff. But at the same time, you might sometimes want to see what they're talking about there and just go in with that lens that they're probably giving you a skewed perspective on things. They're going to leave some stuff out. They're going to leave a lot of the nuance out because they want to tell a narrative. But so it's tough. It would be tough to get all your information from TV and be fully informed.
Yeah, and for those that don't know, NPR is National Public Radio, correct?
Yeah, and PBS, I guess, as well, right? So they do the
Yeah.
PBS NewsHour. That's a pretty good show. There are some decent
Mm.
shows as well. The CBS Sunday, I think it's called. It's not exactly news, but it kind of is. But it's pretty well balanced. They tell nice, good stories about some local community stuff, and it's a commercial publication. I mean, it's not public funded. That's a commercial enterprise. So CBS Sunday Morning is a pretty good show if you want to get some, it's not going to give you today's news per se, but it will a little bit. But I think it's pretty well balanced. It's got some
Hmm.
upbeat stories. It's got some realistic kind of life stories. So, I mean, I think that's good journalism. I think CBS Sunday is a good journalism on television, just as one example.
Okay. Gotcha. And so, shifting a little bit, I was curious what your thoughts were on libel and slander or defamation as it relates to the media. And so, my question around this is whether or not libel and slander or defamation laws should they be updated to be harsher for those in media. And again, we can expand beyond TV media, but media who publish or voice or make false statements that they know to be false. And again, you got to prove that. But um, is not their job to fact check again before making these statements, or is it the freedom of the press and whether they're libelous or slanderous? That comes to the Constitution.
Yeah, I mean, the more I've done this show, the more I've talked with experts, the more I I have probably become more hardcore on the freedom of speech side and the First Amendment side. And I was pretty surprised that Fox was found, or at least settled. I guess they never were found guilty, right? They ultimately
They
just settled,
settled, yeah.
but they were
Hmm.
maybe worried. I don't know if they were worried just about more information getting out, or if they were worried they might lose that case. It's hard to say because I would have liked to see that case go to trial because that's a good example of how these slander laws should be hard. I think it should be hard to you have to say, like you're saying, you have to prove that they really slandered somebody, and sort of with a lot of caveats around that. And I think that's okay. Like, I think it's okay that it's a tough thing to prove that somebody slandered somebody else, and journalists should get some leeway there. I think just like First Amendment political speech should be, is in general the most protected speech, right? It's easier to say, something, if you throw a political piece in, it's almost easier to slander a little bit. For anybody that wants to slander someone, maybe I'm giving them bad, giving a bad little secret there. But if you mix political speech with it, it's much harder because political speech is really something this country values, and I think that's okay. I think that's the right thing to do. I mean, I've I've come to be, I was probably more hardcore on the content management, not just fact checking, but actually like, removing content and things like that side before. And I think I've moved off of that a little bit more towards the, like Germany has some pretty hard laws after Nazism. They have some pretty hard laws about if you use Nazi symbols, or you use Nazi rhetoric and things like that, that speech is not protected. And I think they're revising that a little bit, but because of what happened in the 30s and 40s, they went that way, that very hardcore. And I've talked to a lot of experts on this that sort of think maybe that's not the right approach, because you might almost have a backlash about that, right? It might actually make it, now it's like secret, and I'm going to do this thing that the government doesn't like it, therefore it must be good. So maybe that's backfiring for them. I don't know, but it's just an example of another direction that they've gone that we haven't gone yet. And so I think slander laws should be hard. I think it should be hard to prove that case.
Yeah, to me, it's a seesaw, right? It's freedom of speech, and you know, whether it's slander or libel, it's or censorship is the word I was looking for. Freedom of speech
Mm,
and censorship.
exactly.
There's that seesaw in the middle where you hope that you don't have to censor, and you hope that the freedom or the speech is not being abused. And so your hope is somehow teetering on the middle, but humans are humans, and agendas are agendas, and so well, I don't think you should censor. I absolutely agree with you. I think the First Amendment is a First Amendment. Um, I think we need to figure out a way to not make it so easy to simply knowingly lie about someone.
Right.
And
And one of
one
the,
of the
oh, sorry, go
things,
ahead.
oh no, one I was going to finish up real quick, was one of the things that really troubles me about the lack of enforceability of slander and libel is that it only takes one person to run with an idea to tell 10 more, tell 10 more. And next thing you know, you got 40 million people in this country believing an idea that's 100% false, but it doesn't matter because it's been spread so much. But
Yeah.
you were about to say?
No, yeah, you're exactly right. That it is definitely a balance, and it's a tough one because, um, like you said, the misinformation can spread so fast. It's so much easier to create lies, right? You don't have to fact check. You just say a thing,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just completely made up.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yep.
and there's also another challenge that, you know, we often pit disinformation, um, like as the opposite of news, or good quality journalism, and they're not the same thing. Disinformation is actively trying to cause, a result, an effect, trying to get you to not only think a certain way but probably take a certain action. Whereas good journalism is just to give you the facts, the picture, give you a reasonable version of this reality, and let you decide what those conclusions are. Right. So the two aren't the same. It's like one is propaganda and one is just good information. And we often confuse that good information kind of can fight disinformation directly, and it's kind of true, but it takes a lot of it and a lot of effort. So I think one way, instead of, if we were to look at legislative things, I mean, one way to improve the situation is to have more funding and more um, ways to somehow add local journalism, bring some of these, like, you say, sort of doing your own research. That means you're probably going out and trying to find sort of independent researchers and independent journalists that have done some of this work. Find a way to support that, so there's more of that, and there's more community news, because this is what's really lacking today. Things like that. That's only one example, but I'm not saying I have all the solutions, but that's one where we're really lacking, is kind of good community information. We get caught up in these national affairs because of that's where the news is happening these days, right? It's they kind of need to focus on these national things because they're trying to get a national audience, and no and it has really been a reduction in good local journalism. If we could find ourselves getting more um, informed about our local communities, the politics of our local and state things, we would find less time to get so mad about a lot of this uh, national stuff that probably we don't have a lot, doesn't impact us as much probably, and it also, we don't have much impact over it either.
Yeah. And so I'm thinking, factcheck.org is one of the organizations, and whether they lean left or right or they're accurate or not, that used to, and I haven't checked them in a while, admittedly, but they used to take issues. It's, pants on fire bad or 100% accurate, and they have scales somewhere in between. And somewhere along the line, when they first started this, they were very thought to be very credible. And then somewhere along the line, whether it's, misinformation, disinformation, their credibility has shrunken down a little bit. But to your point about doing research, for me, it's, it's finding the independence, like you said, but also when it comes to law and the way laws are proceed, whether it's Democratic side or Republican side, I just go to Congress.gov and look at it, and yeah, some of them are extremely long and they take a long time to go through. But at least I feel better about forming my opinion if I at least made an attempt to go through some 600-page law and find the portion they're actually talking about, or at least, search the keyword, to get a clear picture of at least what the law is written like. And we all know how laws are written; they're not plain English, and so you have to kind of interpret it old school English and all that stuff. Um, but that's where I started. If it's something congressional, at least go to Congress.gov, pull the actual law, see who put it forward, who voted for it, what's the law actually see, where is it at in the progress of being signed into law. But to that point, isn't this really and before I get to my question, so I used to associate misinformation and disinformation together. I didn't distinguish the two until a couple years ago when I started to see misinformation as something that could really just be accidental. Where disinformation, I always saw that as very intentional, and I looked at misinformation the same way. But forgetting that we're humans, misinformation could 100% be just a simple mistake, and unfortunately, a mistake can spread pretty fast. But misinformation, you'll see retractions. You'll see somebody come on and say, "Hey, got this one wrong." Sometimes, not all the time. But do you agree with that assertion? Misinformation, disinformation, two kind of separate things.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Yeah. 100%. And like you
Yeah.
say, many people innocently spread misinformation, sort of not
Mhm.
knowing, or didn't do enough research or fact checking to see if it's real, but they kind of believe it and they just moved it on. They aren't necessarily it's on some evil agenda or something, right?
Mhm.
They're just happen to spread it along. Yeah. And disinformation is almost always, at least at the roots of who started it, they have an agenda. They're trying to do something with that
Yeah.
information.
Yeah. And so when it comes to misinformation, disinformation, and the fact that it spreads like wildfire because of social media, or you follow your favorite major news network, whatever the reason is, or your circle just believes in that and you can't get them off the ledge, isn't it more so? And this is just my opinion. Isn't it more so a problem of increased numbers of? Now I'm gonna be kind of crass here. Lazy people who don't want to research. Isn't that really the root of how misinformation, disinformation, all this partisan stuff just spreads?
Yeah, and I don't know if people are, less, you know, politically involved now, are less smart. I don't think people really got dumber. Maybe we're busier. I don't know. But yeah, I think that's true, and that's why that's one reason why that social media is a bit of a challenge, because it does require, and our brains are wired for this too, right? You talked about misinformation spread, disinformation spread as well. It's also often because they also use, sort of the outrage bait and things like that to get people to think it's, you know it fits their narrative that they want to hear, and so they're not gonna be as likely to fact check it, right? They're gonna say, I like that. That tells me that, yeah, that person I thought was bad, this is another thing that shows how bad they are. That reinforces my morality, my moral superiority. So I like it. I'm not gonna fact check it. It's good. I like it, so I'm gonna pass it on. So that's also another reason that information passes on, because it's usually, almost always, got some of that sensationalism tagged along with it, right? And that's what helps it spread, and that's both intentionally, uh, you know, obviously, but it's also accidental. It's sort of just how the algorithms work, right? So we spread that stuff, and they like it, and that's the thing that gets the likes and shares and all that. Yeah. So the challenge with this, that everybody's out there, is it's like what you were talking about. Like, that's good journalism, right? That's what that's the definition of good journalism, and the idea that, say somebody that's, somewhat qualified about this would go read that legislation. Somebody would go look at who, and then they would write maybe a summary that somebody that doesn't have that kind of time, like how many of us have that time, that they can maybe do a 5-minute summary of all that and say, here's the information about it, trying to be as unbiased as possible. We could never be 100% unbiased. We're always going to bring some of that to the table. We can't help it, but they could try to be somewhat balanced about it, or as balanced as they can be. Give the information in a shorter way that it gets out there to more of those people you're talking about that are a little lazy, and they're just busy. They don't have the time. And this is what's missing now. And one of the reasons is because that's expensive, right? It's much cheaper. Well, it's super cheap to just tell an outright lie, but it's also cheaper to just kind of pick 5 stories, spend a little bit of time on those, come up with a 2-minute version of those stories. That's your whole day on a 24-hour news channel. If you watch much 24-hour news, it's the same 5 stories all day long, unless something really breaking happens. Um, and so it's much more expensive to do what you're talking about, to do an in-depth analysis and try to be unbiased about it at the end as well, because there's these incentives to tell a story about it that's fitting a narrative for your audience you're trying to serve. So, and ideally, a New York Times or a Wall Street Journal is skew maybe a little bit one way or the other, but they're pretty good. So they can do more of that, but it's a lot more expensive, right? So you see a lot less of that, and that's what we need more of. We need more of that kind of journalism that doesn't those deep dives. Like I did an episode with a right-leaning political scientist about some items from Agenda 47, which is pretty much just some stuff from Project 2025 that Trump has adopted on his website. So he can't walk away from it because it's on his website. He says it. So, but it was like in an hour, I was only able to talk about like 3 things. And Project 2025, you probably know, is like 800 pages long, right? And it's dozens and dozens and dozens of issues. So I was able to do 3 in 1 hour. And where we sort of talked about, what are the backstops? What is this reality? Instead of trying to hype it up, just kind of try to present a real picture of how far could this go? What are the backstops? How does this work? And that took an hour to do, right? So, that's the kind of stuff that, and again, you're back to this, who's even going to listen to an hour, right? They want 30-second TikTok.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I struggle sometimes with this podcast with hour and a half or 2 hour episodes, right? Maintaining, because you can see that analysis on YouTube, maintaining that audience throughout the entire 2 hours. But good topics, good topics keep the audience engaged. But I'll tell a quick story and I'll lead to my next question. I'd say, and I'm not going to even, gloss myself up. I'd say about 95% of the stuff I post on social media, I research it first. This is one of my pet peeves. The 5% kind of sneaks in there where it's something I either seen, the thing we talked about, I've seen it before. I recognize this. This is true. And, oops, I didn't see that one word difference in this particular one. But 95% of the stuff I do research. And so speaking of Project 2025, which you brought up, I did a couple posts in the last month just highlighting different topics in Project 2025. And I found myself in a debate with someone on my page about, I believe it was National Weather Service and the whole umbrella. I think it's 9 different organizations that encompass um, that particular branch, National Weather Service being one of them, and how Project 2025 wanted to change basically the layout and how those 9 organizations operated. A lot of the crux around it was because a lot of the climate change information they put out, they felt was too biased, and so they wanted to make it nonpartisan and a bunch of other stuff as well. And so again, I love to bring facts to an opinion fight. And so I could cite the page number, I do the quotes and all that stuff. And one of the people who took offense to what I was posting, blatantly called me a liar, trying to scare people. That's fine. I get that all the time. But it got into a semantics thing because the page that I quoted in the PDF count was not the same as the actual page that I was citing. And so the page number was on the bottom of the page I was citing, but it wasn't the same number as the PDFs because, the pictures and graphs and they don't have page numbers on every page. And it got to the point where it just dawned on me at one point that we're really arguing about a page number instead of this person simply saying, hey, what you quote is actually on the page you referenced, just not the PDF page number. And this is how, uncivil or simple things get sometimes. And so my question around this is talk about the frustrations and what I call bringing facts to a feelings fight and how someone might deal with that, because that happens a lot. Whether it's left, right, doesn't matter. Whatever your point is, you'll come across, you'll bring facts. They will say, because, it's either reinforced in their beliefs or they just simply don't feel like looking at facts today, that this is what it is. And you just butt heads and butt heads and butt heads. And so at some point, what I found is a person who does all the research and brings all the facts gets extremely frustrated with the conversation because, well, they're not listening to me. I've done the research. It's that thing. We've done the work. So why is someone who hasn't done the work telling me that I'm wrong? So how do you deal with that facts and opinion fight that I just kind of described?
Yeah, we spend a lot of time talking about this kind of stuff on the show. And a lot of it is, you know, um, human traits and human psychology and how
Mm-hmm.
and epistemology, how we come to know things, how we come to believe things, and and the problem with, well, first of all, there's this idea of naive realism, right? So there's this idea of naive realism that if that people think I saw these facts and I came to this conclusion. Therefore, if somebody else sees these same facts, they're going to come to the same conclusion. And that's one thing that's sort of there, that we don't realize that people can take the same facts and come to a different conclusion from those facts. So sometimes the facts aren't even wrong. They actually are, the facts are, both sides have the same facts, but they don't realize, but they've come to a different conclusion. And so people get frustrated when you give them those facts and they come to a different conclusion. Like, how can you go to that conclusion? You're clearly, your brain is broken, like something wrong with you, right? So that's one of these aspects. A lot of the other is this idea of knowledge resistance. There's some other terms for it, that once we become sort of morally attached to these ideas, we get really good at sort of rationalizing away the facts that don't fit the narrative. There's all kind of cognitive biases about that. I mean, you've probably heard, things like confirmation bias. There's lots of other of these cognitive biases that we have as humans, that we're really good at convincing ourselves we have it right. And we can wash away facts. I mean, you look at flat earthers and stuff, right? I mean, um, and, and so it's kind of an extreme example of that. And so we're really good at that. And so once it's become sort of morally attached to us, it's also, there's another aspect of it that's like the social side of it, right? Where it's like the identity theory, the group theory kind of things, where humans are also very groupy, right? This was our evolutionary niche. So uh, we there's a lot of research about this, that we tend to tribe up, and those tribes become critical to our brain thinks they're critical to our survival. So there's this idea that the fear of social death is greater than the fear of physical death once you've attached once you've kind of become identified into what you believe as a tribe, or your in group. And and so what we're talking about is getting ostracized. I can say the wrong thing and I get ostracized by my, so I better continue to believe these things, because if I say I don't believe them, all of a sudden my in group's gonna, I'm afraid my in group's gonna kick me out. And to my brain, that's like a death sentence. I've been kicked out of my group, and in 50,000 years ago, that literally was probably a death sentence if you got kicked out of your group. We traded muscles for brain, right? So we can't fight with a lion, but directly, right? We have to group up, and and we're really good at groups. That was our evolutionary niche. So our brains are hardwired for this, and so it's very hard to overcome that hard wiring, and it takes training, right? It's not innate. Like, talking about doing research, talking about critical thinking, things like this. These are learned skills, and they also have to be practiced over time, and you have to keep practicing or you will get out of touch, and you kind of let that hardwired brain kick in again and take control. And one aspect of fact checking and do your own research has got a little bit of a problem. Is one aspect of good critical thinking is there is a peer process. Like, there's peers that check you. So you can't necessarily do this completely on your own. You sometimes need to be checked by some peers. So you have to work that process in. If you look at like academic systems and others, legal others, there's a peer process that your conclusions are fact checked, are peer reviewed by others. So that factor, if you're not doing that, then you're not really doing research, right? There's no peer, if there's no peer aspect to it. So try to figure out a peer group that can help you, that can do some of that and give you some feedback, and especially along the way. And there's an idea of inquiry based learning. But yeah, the psychology around the fact idea is facts are not really how anybody changes their mind. They play a part a little bit, but there was this was thought about with PSAs. People, a lot of government thought, if we just tell people, viruses, vaccines work, and we'll give them the facts, that will change how many people. It never works, right? It's not, the facts aren't what does it. What it's really the emotional side of our, even for the people that think they're the most rational people that there are on the planet, this is true. Now, it's less true if they practice this a lot, and if they have they've sort of got a peer group and they got a community that is really sort of research oriented and that kind of thing. So it's less with those people, but there's no particular person that's immune from this, right? We're all subject to it, to these emotions, and to this emotional way to coming to conclusions, whether we think we are or not, because even believing we're not is part of the psychology piece of our brain telling us we're the most rational, right? So even the people that believe what we might think are crazy things think the same things about themselves, right? We all think we're sort of the baseline that's got this figured out. And this is why this is a big reason why facts won't help you very much in these kinds of arguments. Facts are fine if there's no emotional attachment to this idea. Like if I asked you how many species of elephant there are, you know, what would you say?
I'd probably say one just because I'm ignorant to the topic, but
And
I've
so, how
only seen
attached
one,
are you
I
to that
think.
answer? Would you say it's how confident are you? Would you give it like on a scale of 1 to 10, like a 3, a 5, a 7?
I'd say five.
Yeah. So
I
you're
put it
not
right in the
super
mid.
confident about it. Why not? Why
No.
not a 7 or 8 or something
Uh,
higher?
because to me, five represents I know about elephants, but I don't know a lot about elephants.
So if you're wrong, what do you how are you going to feel about that?
Okay. Because I,
Right.
I started this thinking I didn't know much about them anyway.
Exactly. And you're not necessarily emotionally attached to how many species of
Yeah.
elephant there are, right? So it turns out there's
Yes.
three now. So there's the
Hmm.
Indian elephant and two species of African elephant. There's a
Hmm.
Sahara one or desert one and a forest uh, species. But yeah, the point is we're not emotionally attached to how many species of elephant there are. So now facts can have be the biggest influence in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, these things, even species, are kind of one of these things that can change over time. Like there used to be two, and they decided, well, this other forest elephant is now a new species. So this gets into that other issue that people often, that especially people that are very critical of science, often do, is that, well, science had it wrong before, they're going to have it wrong again, and so we can't believe anything. Well, that's not right either, because what you're basing what you know now about is on the best evidence we all have. And again, it's part of that peer system that this is what we sort of believe now. We know, yeah, something might change. We might discover a new one, or we might figure out we got something wrong. But this is the best evidence we have now for that. And that's another factor. It's not a complete, that doesn't mean you throw everything out because now you can't know anything. Just because, if you know a lot, like evolution, like there's a lot of evidence about evolution, right? But there's probably a lot of things that we still haven't quite got right about evolution. But the fundamental idea of evolution is pretty clear, right? Like that's well known. So this is, where things go wrong with people that kind of have a black and white view of the world, that because we've changed something about evolution, theory so far, that means nothing about it is right. And that's not true, right? So all of these things play into this. So back to what the original question was. So if it doesn't have a moral attachment to it or some kind of an emotional attachment, then facts can have an effect. But what's happening now is because of this toxic divide that we're in, so many things now have emotional or moral attachment to them. Like we're upset about vaccines or have a moral attachment to them. Vaccines have an emotional attachment to it. These things that at one time wouldn't have, right? All we so that's a big challenge in our life now, that with so many things we're sort of dumping it in some kind of a political identity bucket, even though why does that have a political identity, need to have a political identity associated with it? But once you do that, then facts become not a very reasonable way to persuade. I'm not in the business of persuading. I'm not in the business of telling people how to persuade. But if that's what the business that you are in, you first have to seek to understand their motivations, understand why they believe the thing they do, what brought them to that point. And then so what facts support that, and then maybe those facts can be part of that conversation. But until you understand why they believe the thing they do, how they came to think that way, no fact is going to change their mind.
Hmm. No, I will say, first of all, that was an extremely great answer. I will say the biggest thing I took from that is the peer review part, which is something I'd never factored in ever with any of the conversations that went right, that went left, that were well received. I've never thought about the fact, and I was a physics and math double major at one point, so that's where my frustration comes in because it's all
Hey,
fact
me
based.
too.
It's proving theorems, and everything proves itself. So
Right.
um, if I provide evidence that proves something, then yeah, you understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But the peer review piece is something that we don't think about. I know, at least I don't think about when it comes to social media, when it comes to TV media. The peer reviewing on TV happens outside of our scope. The peer reviewing on social media rarely happens unless it's people who agree with your concept or what you're
Yeah.
posting. They're not really reviewing, they're just kind of agreeing with you. And so there's nothing that says, hey, I'm going to post this, and then these 15 people are going to check it yes or exit no, and then it gets decided if that's posted and it says these 7 people agree with me. Um, yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting concept. And I wonder if that's something that we can even try to incorporate in social media someday. That when you post something, and that's kind of the fact checkers, right, that happen for social media. It's kind of reviewing behind the scenes, and even that is a black box, right? You don't know how that process is actually happening. You post something
Right.
and something gets flagged, or you post something and something doesn't. You have no idea what the mechanism behind that is. But so I want to shift a little bit.
I'm
And you
going to
kind
note
of
real
brought it
quick
up.
while we're on it before we jump to
Yeah,
the next thing.
sure.
One thing I'll say about that with,
Hmm.
the Twitter has the community thing. What do they call it?
Hmm.
What do they call it? Where it's like
Uh,
I forget what they call it now, but where it's like it's kind of similar. It's got a little bit of that. It could have it. Like again, there's a
mhm.
lot of black box behind the scenes. Like you don't know what's getting filtered and how it's working, how it really works. But the idea of it to me is the kind of thing where you get the like what do they call it? Community notes, I think they call it something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's
I
kind
think
of
that's
it's
it.
kind of it plays it could play a little bit of that role if implemented, well.
Yeah, and then with that, even that can be perceived as being biased. Well, they only put notes on these, and they don't do that. It's there's so much skepticism seeded right now. It's hard to, and it comes back to my very first question. I think first or second question about trusting any media, because there's so much doubt and distrust that's seeded in everything at this point. It's really hard to get that baseline where we can just say, let's start over. Let's everybody start over. let's act like we trust each other. Let's act like we're genuine in our behaviors and what we're posting, what we're sharing, and all that stuff. And it's so hard for me to see us getting back to that point. Hopefully someday we do. Hopefully, I think it to me it starts with those in office, those political talking heads, because and that's really a bad way to describe it, but because they're setting the messaging so much for the left, the right, the center, every topic even vaccines. I mean, vaccines. To your point, I know I grew up taking vaccines. I took a tetanus booster 10 years ago or something like that without thinking twice about it. But now everything is being scrutinized. If there's a new vaccine, well, why didn't the other ones work? No, it's a new variant. Why is there a new variant? Everything is being questioned at this point, which is very frustrating, by the way, because I may be someone who doesn't run to the pharmacist, to pop pills every single day. But if my primary care, who knows me better than anybody else, as far as my health perspective, says, hey, you should probably take this because they know I'm not a medicine person. If they say, listen, you got to take this one, then I'm probably going to do it. And we don't even trust our doctors really much anymore, which is,
And if you're going to
kind
get
of
a
to your
second
point.
opinion, it's probably not going to be, Fred 37 on TikTok, right? You're going to go to another doctor,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we're to
Exactly.
the point where we're trusting Fred 37 more than our own doctor.
Yeah. Because he says what we already believe. So before we go to the next segment, which is first thoughts, let's talk about Outrage Overload Podcast and talk about your experience with that so far. Because when I kind of did my background research and looked up your profile and looked at your website and everything, there's some amazing topics on there. And you put that with the idea and the things we've discussed already. I don't know why I hadn't come across your podcast before. So talk about the genesis of that, where it started, how it's going, and where you see it going in the future.
Yeah. Um, yeah, so the genesis really was what I talked about a little bit before about that kind of this toxic environment we're in and kind of trying to being curious, trying to go kind of understand that more. And I think I'm similar to you in that I'm curious. I want to kind of understand things, and I sort of believe that yeah, if you just get down to the root of this situation, we'll understand what's going on, and we'll be able to fix it. And so that was kind of the genesis of it, and so it all started with, or I shouldn't say it all started, but a big factor of it was a paper that was written in 2020 where they looked at this topic. It was put together by dozens of top scientists, and they came up with a term they called political sectarianism, um, where our they characterize our current situation of toxic polarization as not only is the other side wrong and stupid, I don't like them, but they're actually sort of morally bad, and that's kind of where we're at now. And that kind of was the genesis. That's the first couple of episodes talk about that, and then we sort of branch from there into sort of this whole adjacency around that. There's this idea of the outrage industry where we talked a little bit in the very beginning about all the incentives that are out there for this whole world of the early days. It was like the Rush Limbaughs and that kind of thing, right? And they just fed off, now it's sort of the Alex Joneses and the Maddow, Rachel Maddow, this kind of stuff. They just like feed off this outrage, like they get people mad that and that keeps it going. So there's a whole incentive structure there. There's a whole incentive structure around the news, whole incentive structure around social media with their algorithms. So all of these things contribute to this, and so that's what we talk about on the show a lot. What are some of these underlying psychologies there? what are some of the technology that's being used, and how does that play into it, and what are maybe some technology options. We even go into legal sometimes, what's happening, maybe constitutionally. And I also talk to a lot of practitioners that are kind of working in loosely like kind of bridge building and depolarization is kind of the language. So I'll talk to practitioners, and Peter Coleman has identified something like 8,000 of these kind of organizations out there, people looking at this problem. So that's encouraging to me that there's so many smart people kind of looking, accepting that this is a big problem, and we need to work on it, and seeing it almost like a climate change scope, a scale, a magnitude of problem that's going to be generational. Like this isn't going to just go away.
No, I love the idea of kind of pulling back the curtain on all this stuff, right? Because we just exist in it, right? We don't really pay attention to the fact that it's impacting us so much. And I think when we do talk about it, it's more so to complain about one side or the other, and not really
Right.
to say, "Hey, they're all doing this." And so I know I love peeling back the curtain on that. I love using that analogy. I use it a lot, by the way, but I love pulling back the curtain on that one. So cool. And where do you see election when we're recording this is what 20 days away? I think when this episode drops it'll be a week and a half, maybe, I think. So where do you see things going, regardless of who wins? Where do you see this all going? Because I find it hard to believe we're just going to shut it down, in November, and go back to a sense of normalcy and fact finding and truth telling and all that stuff.
Yeah, I did a documentary episode over the summer called "Knife the Knife on the America on the Knife's Edge," and it's kind of
Mm.
talking about this, that we're so divided, so we're equally divided, and we're also bitterly divided. And yeah, as you say, no matter who wins, it's going to be close. Unless something really weird happens, it's a clear indication that it's going to be close. Every election since you talked about being involved in elections since 2000 have been close. Like in the past, presidential elections in particular, would swing once in a while, right? So you'd see a pretty big swing, maybe a 20-point swing, um, 15 points was not that unusual. You don't see that anymore. These are won with a few points. We're living in a 50 plus one world right now, 50% plus one world. And so no matter who wins, basically half the country is going to be very disappointed. And that's not going to change anytime soon. And there's also, I think, a huge problem with this perception that we have about our own government, how it works, and what politicians can and cannot do. We put too much on presidents, like we think presidents can do more than they really can, and when they can't, we kind of get mad, and then and that opens us up to be more inviting to populism and authoritarianism, things like that, because we think presidents should be able to just go fix things, and that's not really how our structure works, right? We've got in our democratic republic, it's really hard to get things done. You need to find things that are cross-cutting, and you need to find compromise and something that has broad support in order to move forward, because of the way we've divided up the power in our system. And so, but people don't like that, right? Like people like democracy in the abstract, but not so much in practice, right? We want somebody to just go in and fix things our way. But when you say, well, what does your way mean? They explain it, and you go, well, half the country doesn't want to do that and is very opposed to it. So now what? Right. And we don't like that. Now what? We don't like that this reality that things are hard. It's hard to get things done, and you're going to have to find some broad support for your agenda. And we don't like that. We want to dominate the other side. And we're in this fantasy world that we'll be able to dominate the other side. Like somehow my side is going to win, and we're going to build a coalition that's so big, we'll just wipe out the other side for some long period of time. This is not a realistic. I don't see that happening. No experts that I've talked to see that as a reality. If you go back, this is 25 years now. We've been more or less in this 50 plus one world that we're in. We're very divided. We're bitterly divided. So that's not going away. So yeah, after this election, I think we're going to be right back where we are. There's going to be half the country mad about it. What actions they take and how that goes. It seems like it escalates a little bit every election cycle, right? I mean, the Pew Brookings Institute, I should say, does a thing they call America's Values Survey, and I have some challenges with the way they ask some of these questions, but they've been asking about sort of violence, willingness, interest in violence, a willingness to do violence and things like that in those surveys for about 10 years now, and it's strong. I mean, even if you discount that they may be overstating it by the way they ask those questions, it's still a real thing, right? There's a reasonable amount of the country that's thinks violence is the answer, thinks revolution type things the answer, and that's not going away, and it seems like that's just kind of continuing, accelerating. So
Getting worse.
getting worse, yeah, and I think that's the worst thing that of all the things that I've sort of learned from the experts. The experts sort of say the way you get out of this is you sort of hit rock bottom, right? But what's rock bottom? Like, what does it look like? Because we had January 6th, that wasn't it. We had the pandemic, that wasn't it. What does rock bottom look like? I don't know.
Yeah. I will say the indicator to me that we're actually going to be fixing things or be on the right path is always been Congress coming together and passing a balanced budget, because that's something that hasn't happened since, I think, what, 93, 4, whatever it was. I think Clinton was the last one, Congress that had a balanced budget. And since then, we've been so polarized that it's not, it doesn't even come up anymore. If you think about it, nobody even talks about balancing the budget anymore. It's these continuing, what do they call it? Continuing resolution or something
Hmm.
that Congress does to just basically keep spending more money. But the concept of a balanced budget used to be a talking point. And it used to be something that was talked about a lot more on the right, but also talked on the left as well. But it used to be something, hey, we're going to balance the budget. We're going to, bring costs down. Nobody's talking about that anymore. And so the way I see it is when we actually can come together to sign and pass and implement a balanced budget to start caring about how money is spent and income and outflows again, then I think that's when we'll say, hey, we've got some hope of these two sides coming together and actually cohabitating in a way that's beneficial for this country as opposed to beneficial for themselves or the narrative. So that's how I
Yeah,
look
and
at it.
to not finish on a dull negative, I do want to say that that's the thing that one of the things that gives me a lot of hope is that there's clearly a demand and an interest in bringing the temperature down, right? And I think that's a one of these quiet majority kind of things, right? Because they do get drowned out by news media, they get drowned out by social media, they get drowned out by our friends who just want to tell us how bad the other side is. So our whole lives are that more, not to say moderate in like centrist positioning, but more moderate in rhetoric, more moderate in how they think about the other side and things like that. That's clearly a growing group, and it seems to be it's probably a majority, right? I mean, I think these loud voices we're hearing are probably like 20% on each side. So they aren't the majority, but it's the way we think the world looks like that because that's all we see.
They're very loud, very
They're
loud.
very loud. Yeah. Yeah. They just dominate online spaces, right? I mean, there's no
Hmm.
room for somebody that comes in and says, well, what about this, kind of nuanced or
Yeah.
cross cutting perspective? Oh, no, you're going to get booted out instantly or just
Yeah. This is
flamed
not the
so bad. It's
location
like,
for
it's not
that
worth
one.
my time.
Hmm.
Yeah.
All right.
And
So,
those
David,
cross
so
cutting,
now,
I was just going to say
oh,
those
good.
people with those cross cutting. This is what we have to somehow find a way to champion. Those people with those cross cutting views of the world, because we
Hmm.
think they don't exist, and often, but most of us are like that. Even if we aren't out there saying it that loudly, most of us probably have some cross cutting ideas. We're not 100% online with whatever we might identify as kind of our side. We're not necessarily 100 online with like all their policies. Like, that's a weird policy. I don't think that.
Hmm.
So almost all of us have some of these cross cutting things, and we have to get better at kind of championing that. Like, that's not only okay, that's like our way forward. Those people are our
Yeah.
way forward.
Well, yeah, I talked about my last episode, the old Whitney Houston song, I Believe the Children Are Our Future. I keep saying I'm waiting for these children to be empowered to do something because they're being drowned out right now. But
Yeah.
yeah, so David, now's time for my favorite segment with my guest called First Thoughts, which is sponsored by SRE Solutions Inc. SRE Solutions provides complete, robust, precise, and reusable real-world solutions, satisfying and resolving your business needs. For more information, visit rebrand.ly/DHPSRE. And so, for those joining for the first time, like I always say, shame on you, but I'm happy you're here. The way First Thoughts works is I pose a word or a phrase to my guests to get their first thoughts. Now, clearly, I don't make the guests privy to this because that would kind of destroy the whole point of First Thoughts. So, David, great name again. Just going to keep saying that. Are you ready for some first thoughts?
I feel like I'm in the hot seat, but sure, throw them at me.
Sure. People used to get afraid of this segment, this mini segment. It's okay. I try to start off with something softball and we'll go from there. So, first thought is a phrase, actually, the concept of going viral. What's your first thought?
One of the problems when you have a show like I do, and you probably are kind of heads down to some of your stuff, is that you know everything is kind of in the frame of the stuff you've been reading and researching and looking at, so you always see it that way.
Hmm.
Um, I guess my first thought on the concept of it is, um, I guess my first thought is I'm kind of confused why it's become so important to our
Mm,
to people. Like they will give up their job to go viral. They will give up, something else to go viral.
yeah.
It's something about it's a sort of, I don't know if depressing is quite the right word, but it's kind of a concerning thing that we're so that we have fallen in love with this need to go viral, or this desire to
Hmm.
go viral, that it concerns me, especially with the younger people.
Yeah. Yeah, I think some of the motivation's got to be financial. I mean, the ability to go from a 9 to 5 that you may or may not like to suddenly you're worth $10 million. Even though 10 million today is a lot different than years ago,
Yeah.
but um, to be able to have that flexibility, the instant freedom, if you will, is pretty motivating. I'm guessing. But I think some too just
So
want to be
maybe that's
famous.
the sort of the new American dream.
Yeah, I mean it's a nice shortcut. Like I play the Powerball and Mega Million every week. I'm hopeful.
Yeah, yeah. Probably about the same odds of going viral, right?
Probably right. Yeah,
Or at least to the $10 million point.
yeah. All right. So next first thought, and we've kind of touched or danced around this idea during this conversation, but cultivation theory. What's your first thought?
I'm not even familiar with what that is, to be honest with you.
Got
Cultivation
you.
theory?
So it's a social science theory that explains how media consumption, especially television, impacts a person's beliefs, values, and perceptions of reality. And so, if I remember correctly, doing the research, there was someone back in the 50s or 60s who basically said if someone watches enough of a show or an idea, kind of like today, they'll start to believe that's the reality. So if they watch a lot of violence on TV, they'll start to believe the world is violent,
Right.
et cetera, that type of stuff.
Yeah, I think I've heard some of that phenomenon given other labels as well. Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's certainly, I'm not an expert on this, and I have spoke with both people from media as well as obviously social scientists and others about this kind of thing. Um, and yeah, there are several cognitive biases kind of related to this, right? Like it's the kind of repeat a thing enough, it becomes believable, and we have some innate
Yeah.
part of human part of our human psychology is to actually sort of believe things, even though we talk a lot about people don't trust anything. But it's one of our shortcuts is to sort of believe first and have to be shown wrong later. And
Mm-hmm.
the counter narratives to that thing, even if they're the facts and they're true, to say to a lie, have less power. Our brain then still brings back the original thing, kind of forgets the counter narratives, right? Because it had that first seed planted that this thing was said and it was true. And I know that's one of these psychological factors that play into that. So yeah, I mean, it feels like it's just yet another piece of our of our psychology to kind of
Yeah.
like a lot of our a lot of the psychology that helped us survive 50,000 years ago is not necessarily doing us a great service anymore in a multicultural complicated world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'd say when I was doing the research for this particular first thought, because I like to come up with things for first thoughts that drive the conversation home for things we talked about. And that's where I came up with this. Really looking for something around how the media impacts and this cultivation theory that, and I forget the name of the person. I should have put it in my notes. Who came up with this idea? But there's so many layers to the subsections of this that he came up with as well. And even reading the contention or the pushback or blowback that he faced for these ideas, and those saying his theory is kind of centered on the idea that people can evolve, and here we are in 2024, and we're kind of facing this. But um, yeah, no, it's very indicative of the way things are right now. And so when I read it, I'm like, wait, this was in the 60s or 50s. I can't remember the year, but seems like 2024 to me. Um,
Right.
but yeah, all right. So last first thought: the next president of the United States will be. What's your first thought?
Well, my first thought is it is I can't predict. I can't. It's so close, and I've had a lot of people talking to me about, oh, it's not close, right? I mean, isn't this person going to win or that person going to win? And it's also funny that both sides say, um,
Mm,
I can't believe it's this close, right?
yeah,
So both sides believe the other candidate's so terrible they can't believe it's this close. So
yeah,
I think it's an absolute toss up. It's going to be I think it's going to be a wild night. And actually a wild
yeah.
couple of weeks to probably figure it out. But I mean, I'm leaning towards. It seems like, I mean, one of the biggest indicators that would tell me that Trump is perhaps going to win is this indicator. There's an indicator. It's like something like the country's going in the wrong direction. Like, it's one of those kind of polling kind of things. And I don't,
Mhm.
may not be, that might not be the exact language, but it's along those lines. And when that number is low, I mean, the incumbent is, and that number is really low. And so
Yeah.
I think Harris will be seen as the incumbent. So that number kind of
Mhm.
tells me that might be enough to send it over. But it's a crazy election season.
Yeah, and us being math science guys, one of the things I always look at and why I think it's a toss up too is because everything is within the margin of error. You can't put
Yeah.
out a margin of error and say, you know, don't pay attention to the margin of error. It's really not this close. Well, if everything's inside the margin of error, then that error is possible.
And
Um,
these poll margin of errors have been historically getting bigger and bigger as how off these
yeah,
polls
four
can
and a
be.
half, 5.5%. It's crazy.
And no one's even
I mean,
close to
plus
that
or
kind of a
minus five
lead.
and a half is an 11-point swing. I mean, that's an
Yeah,
11-point swing.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. Yeah. So I mean, I guess maybe they're just protecting themselves and saying we don't know either. But yeah, it's not
Yeah.
particularly helpful.
Yeah. I haven't done this yet because I can't remember the name of the guy who, big math guy who used to predict things a couple years ago. I think he predicted almost every election. And can't remember his name right now, but I haven't looked up his prediction yet because I usually do that for every presidential cycle to see where he's at. And I think he got either 16 wrong or 20 wrong. I can't remember which one. One of the
Right.
two he
I'm
got wrong.
remembering something like that as well. Yeah, he got one of the. I don't think it was 16. I think he got 16 right, but he might have got 20 wrong. I can't remember for sure.
Gotcha.
I don't
Yeah.
remember
So
though. Yeah, I
I
think
want
you're
to
right
do
though.
that.
Something he got something wrong. I think.
Yeah. All right.
Well, and
So
the
this
other
season,
indicator is Dow, right? I don't know if
yeah,
Dow has been sort of accurate for a long
way up
time, but
there. Yeah.
yeah. So I don't know if that'll play this time.
And I
I
will
think
say,
some of those things are coincidences.
yeah, but before we wrap this up, I will say it's interesting that I guess the 8 years ago, the Dow was such a big talking point on the election cycle and the campaign trail. I meant to say, um, and now that it's like over 40, I don't even know where it's at. By the way, just a quick side note on stocks. I have stocks that underperform the entire industry, and it makes no sense to me. The entire industry is 250, 300% up. My one little stock is sitting there at 4%. It makes no sense.
Right.
But
I think everybody's got a few of those in their portfolio somewhere.
yeah, it drives me nuts. I'm looking at all these other things that if I just invested in those instead of this one little stock. But anyway, just a mini bitch fest. Sorry about that. So yeah, this season I'm turning over the power to my guests before we wrap up in a segment I call TO First Thoughts. And David, what this is an opportunity for you to throw a first thought back at me to get my first thought. So if you had something you wanted to throw at me as a first thought, what would it be?
um, my first thought, because it's really where my head is right now, is what's your first thought about our um, the democratic institutions of America?
Hmm. I think my first thought would be that their integrity is declining. And I say integrity because I always look at, to me, money is the root of everything at this point. It's being in power, it's staying in power, it's getting money, it's maintaining money. And not to say that this country was always about the people, but the foundation of it was. And I feel like we're getting farther and farther away about the constituents that our elected officials are supposed to serve. And it's more so about me just getting the next election one and the one after that and the one after that and climbing up the scale and becoming a speaker or leader of the Senate or, aspiring to become president. It's unless you go very, very local, it's not about the people to me anymore. I think the more you get outside of local, you get outside of state, you can do national Congress, House, Senate, or presidency. It's just not even about the people anymore. And I don't even know how to get back there, because again, it's our problem we're facing now with the media and facts. How do we even level set to come back and say, hey, well, actually, I will say this. I do know one way. It probably never happen because they will have to vote for it themselves. But term limits. I think if we figure out a way for Congress to vote term limits for themselves, um, then we can actually get back to being about the people because we'll get a fresh rotation of younger, fresher ideas. Not to say younger is better, but more people centric, hopefully. Again, hopefully, fingers crossed, that will be the result. But I think I've been preaching term limits for it seems like decades now. I'm not even that old. But if we could get congressional term limits in place somehow, I think that's a great way to start getting back to people and increasing the integrity of the democracy.
Hmm. Right, because it may not. It would be more like the original idea of it was that this was a public service rather than a career.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, there's some people 40, 50. I mean, Joe Biden himself is what, darn near 60 years in politics. I mean, not to say it's good or bad. I mean, there's some people who can serve the people for 50, 60 years, but I think we should have an opportunity to say thank you for your service after 3 terms or 4 terms. Let's move on to other ideas. Um, and it's part of it is who's to say that your career 40 years, 50 years shouldn't be serving the people if that's what you're doing? Who's to tell you shouldn't be able to do that? But at the same time, you know, almost every level has term limits, with the exception of Supreme Court and Congress. So why not Congress as well?
And the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and Supreme Court's a whole other topic. That's gonna be a tough sell. That'll be a very tough sell.
Oh, you mean getting term limits there?
Yeah,
The
yeah. I
American
think to
people are for it, but yeah, whether you can get that through, how that would work, and again, it comes back to what we were talking about before, that you need a broad support for it in order for something like that to pass. And
yeah.
as long as
I
we're in
actually
this
think
divide and
strangely
vote.
enough that I actually think strangely enough that you have a better chance of getting congressional term limits than Supreme Court term limits, just because of the power and influence Supreme Court has. Not to say they would outwardly say, "Hey, if you do this, then this decision is pending," but I feel like that's the power they're wielding right now, where you kind of just don't know. I mean, you kind of do know, but you don't know. Excuse me, how far it'll go with decision making with SCOTUS. Um, I mean, even right now we got Supreme Court judges who take accused of taking favors, accused of sailing on boats and flying on planes and all these other things that they, in theory, shouldn't be doing. So it's both sides. It's whether it's Congress or Supreme Court, it's going to be extremely hard to get term limits on either one of them.
Yeah,
But I
just
think
like
it's a great start.
it's really hard to get do that much about gerrymandering, just because it's a complicated, the legal system
Yeah,
that enforces it is challenging.
yeah,
Yeah, and it's a lot of this election reform is probably a place where the founders maybe didn't get it. Like, I mean, I think they did a really good job. They did a great job to sort of get this
hmm
country kicked off, despite all the problems and in clear places they got wrong. But they still
yeah,
did a pretty good job given the timing and everything else. But that's one place where I think they left it way too vague. I think they just relied too much on good faith, and
yeah.
we don't have good faith anymore.
Yeah, that's why I always say to people, the Constitution is a great roadmap, but there's a reason there's amendments. It
Right.
wasn't perfect. So,
And in this polarized world, we can't get amendments passed anymore, right? There's no such
oh
thing as a
yeah,
2/3 majority, right? That's never going to
no,
happen.
mm-mm.
So it makes a bunch of parts of the Constitution that require 2/3, because it's not the only thing that requires 2/3 majority or some kind of a large majority, and that can't happen anymore. Like, there's no such thing as a majority
yeah,
anymore. Right now, I mean, we have to. It all starts with depolarizing and getting rid of that, lowering that, so that you could find some common things to work on. You could appreciate that um, this compromises is the only way stuff's going to happen,
hmm
rather than
yeah,
constituents thinking you have some magical power, and that we basically force politicians to make promises they can't keep.
yeah. That's what always, and I know we're going to wrap up soon, but that always cracks me up a little bit because you see presidents on both sides of the aisle, independents, Green Party, wherever, making all these promises, and it's 100% dependent on Congress getting through the system to get what you want done. Um, and there's no single topic bills that ever go through, so you're fighting against that uphill battle as well. There's no clean. They want to call it clean bill. There's no clean bill that ever goes through Congress, or rarely, I should say, not ever, but rarely goes through Congress to tackle that one topic that you campaigned on. So it's comical sometimes to hear them on the political campaign stump talk about things they probably will never do.
But we have to take kind of the blame for it a little bit, because we tell them to do that, right? I mean, and our
Yeah,
expectations are messed up. Like, we have to have better understanding. We need more civics education about how our own
mm,
government works.
yeah. We're about to get to a whole other topic that I could just rail on for civics, but all right, Dave. So us wrap this up. Before I let you go, as I always do, I give you an opportunity as a guest to talk about or share anything that you'd like to share. So if there's anything you want to talk about or share, feel free to do so now.
Yeah, I mean, this has really been great. I really appreciate the conversation. I do really enjoy the episodes that I've listened to so far on your show, so I'm going to subscribe and pick up the rest of them. Um, And in terms of my show, I love feedback. All of us podcasters do. So if anybody listens to one episode and says it's the worst thing ever, I've been wanting to hear that, right? So I love feedback. So you can find me at outrageoverload.net. Also, there's a contact page there, but if the email is outrageoverload@gmail.com, just want to send me a short direct note. I'm also all the socials, Outrage Overload. So you can also reach me that way. So I like I said, I love feedback. I'd love to have some feedback on any episode. I don't even, like, people often say pick one. I don't know. Pick any latest episode that looks interesting, and let me know what you think. I love to hear that. And I'm sure that taking too much feedback can maybe send the podcast in too many different directions, but I still love getting it. So that's my main message.
That it does. I get some comments in boxes sometimes. I'm like, wait, that's not even what I was talking about. What are you talking about? But yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
fun. Commentary is fun. I'll just say that. There's some that I get. I'm like, oh, got to delete that one. Let's just delete that one.
Yeah.
Uh, but again, thanks, David, for stepping to Dave's head. As I've said all season, have a great rest of 2024.
Thank you.
My favorite segment on my podcast is my GRIN, which stands for Great Reason to Be in Love with Now. Before we talk about the great reason to be in love with now, check out Opus Clip. Opus Clip is the #1 AI video clipping and editing tool that repurposes your long videos into viral short videos in just one click. For more information, visit rebrand.ly/DHP Opus Clip. That's rebrand.ly/DHP Opus OPUS Clip. The date this episode drops, we are exactly 11 days away from Election Day. Thank God. If you're like me, you can't wait for this election and everything about it to be over. Harvard Business Review published an article on Election Day in 2020, how ironic, under their emotional intelligence section, entitled A Self-Care Guide to Help You Get Through Election Day. And it was authored by, and I might butcher the name, Rachita Arni Ravishankar. Right? Look it up. And it serves to answer this question: how can you manage your mental health on Election Day? Now, according to Dr. Lynn Bufka, who is cited in the article, a clinical psychologist at the American Psychological Association, or the APA, how we think about the future or even near pending events like this election can elevate our emotional responses and pique our anxieties. So how do we deal with it? The anxiety, the frustration, the anger even, and more. And so they offer up 7 different ways that you can deal with anxiety, frustration, anger, and more. We're going to go through them really quickly. Number 1, take stock of your feelings. They say Election Day is probably going to bring up a lot of different emotions for you, so take some time to check in with yourself. Ask yourself, how am I feeling right now? And they say answer honestly. Naming your emotions can help you feel more in control of them. Now, this is fine. Check in with yourself as you're going through the day, and we'll talk about different things you can do during the day. But as you're going through the day, take moments to pause, say, am I getting too amped up? Am I looking at this and this is firing me up? If I'm talking to that person, this is firing me up. Am I just generally nervous because I'm looking at early poll numbers, blah, blah, blah? Be honest with yourself. If you need to, disconnect. And we'll talk about different ways as well. Number 2, try to get at least 2 things done today. Now, this gives me distraction, but you'll see. To give your brain a break, think about some everyday tasks that you can use to distract yourself while also feeling productive, they say. Write down 5 things that you've been avoiding lately and attempt to cross 2 off your list. A couple examples: vacuum the carpet. I have a Roomba, so yeah. Rake some leaves. Probably will be a lot of leaves by then, probably because I live near a forest that has a whole family of trees. But to their point, disconnect from politics, disconnect from the updates and poll numbers and conversations with friends and family and all that stuff, but try to get some other stuff done. Number 3, they say set up a solidarity chat group. Now, I've never heard this term before, but it's literally in quotes, solidarity chat group. They say think about who you want to be in contact with. I 100% agree with that. Don't engage with people who want to start debates while you're feeling low. Put your phone down and walk away when needed. Now, I agree with this, but I think this also feeds into some of the anxiety, the anger, frustration you may be feeling if you have a chat group, even if it's a people who 100% agree with your political ideology, right? Because they're not just going to say, oh, I'm so glad I agree with A and B and C. They're going to also fire up them criticisms and the hot topics and those things that might get you fired up and frustrated and angry and anxious again. So I understand the concept of a solidarity chat group. But I even would say if you feel like you're gonna go from 0 to 100 just from the thought of the day, probably even stay away from those chat groups. Number 4, 100% agree with. Limit social media or news notifications. Now again, if you're hypersensitive, hyper anxious, hyper frustrated, this makes sense. They say social media can trigger us in ways we might not want to be triggered. 100% true. Disable all notifications except for the 1 or 2 news outlets you trust the most. Agree with the first part, not necessarily the second part. If you're going to be hypersensitive on that day, turn off all notifications. Put your phone in airplane mode. Do whatever you need to do. 100% agree with limiting social media and news if that's going to trigger you in any way. Number 5, love this one. Make a feel-good playlist. They say listening to music can have a profound impact on your emotions and body. Slow tempo songs, hello, R&B, jazz, right up my alley, can quiet your mind and relax your muscles. 100%. I think election day, this whole house, every speaker in it's going to be blasting some jazz and R&B all day. We might even light some candles. I don't know. Set the mood in case it's good or bad, whatever. But I love that. Make a feel-good playlist. Number 6, interesting. Write yourself notes or reminders. And I vibe with this one a little bit. If you find it hard to stay off your phone, which is probably with me, but add a quote to the lock screen as a note to self. Choose something that makes you feel calm and reassured, or choose a thought or behavior you want to practice throughout the day. You can also go the traditional route and stick some post-it notes. Now, I kind of love this because, now me being graphically inclined, I might create something on a lock screen to say, hey, breathe, relax, it's okay. That's something I would do. Post-it notes, I do use them, but I use them more for note-taking and toss them in the trash once I'm done with the note-taking. But 100% understand that. Reminding yourself every time you pick up your phone, it's going to be okay. Reminding yourself, stay off Facebook or whatever. I like that. The last one is more like general advice, and it's however you feel, know that it's okay. They say things might not turn out as you expect them, and it might feel like there's no way out. It's okay to feel that way. Don't judge yourself. Sit with those feelings. I don't know about that part, but let them come so that they can go. I understand now. Ask yourself, what is in my control? And finally, accept whatever happens to the election and your emotions. Acceptance does not mean that you endorse something. Again, acceptance does not mean that you endorse something. It simply means you acknowledge things for what they are so that you can move forward from there emotionally and otherwise. This is a polarizing, yet again, election. And so regardless of which candidate wins or how it even goes, if it's even over that night, which is like the worst case scenario, that we're still talking about this the day after election, trying to figure out who won again. But accepting and no, we had January 6th, and that was a whole embodiment of not accepting. But accepting what happens is a key to getting through this if you're really going to be triggered by this election. And so those 7 things with dealing with the anxiety, frustration, anger, and so much more, take stock of your feelings. Try to get some other things done that day. I'm not sure about this one, but I'll put it out there. Set up your solidarity chat group. Limit your social media and news notifications. Make a feel-good playlist. Write yourself some notes and reminders, and know that however you feel throughout the day and at the end of the actual election, whenever it's certified and there's a winner, know that it's okay. Now, you may be wondering how this can be a great moment to be in love with now. Regardless of what happens on November 5th, it's going to be okay. Focus on what you can control, how you can positively impact your life and the life of others, and motivate yourself daily to take the next step on your path. I know it's easy to get wrapped up in the politics in this nation, the politics of the state or local governments that you belong to, but you have to understand that ultimately every day you wake up, besides it being a blessing, every day that you wake up is an opportunity for you to take action that impacts your life in a positive way or the life of someone else in a positive way. And despite how absolutely clusterfuck this election is and the politics in this nation is, that's always up to you. And you have control and power in that. I want to thank David Beckemeyer for stepping into Dave's head and really encompassing everything we've been saying on this podcast for 5 years about politics and the outrage aspect of it and the way the politics is. And I love the conversation that we had and the conversation we had before and after since. So check him out on Instagram and Twitter at Outrage Overload. On LinkedIn, David Beckemeyer. Facebook, Outrage Overload. YouTube, Outrage Overload. And the website is outrageoverload.net. Support our sponsors and partners, SRE Solutions, Inc. You can check them out at rebrand.ly/DHP SRE for all your PC support, repair, antivirus removal, website design, network runs, and so much more. Check out SRE Solutions, Inc. And check out Adapt to Adopt at rebrand.ly/DHP A2A for all your adoption information, resources, and so much more. Again, check out Adapt to Adopt. And our partner, Opus Clip at rebrand.ly/DHP Opus Clip for all your automation AI short clippings of long clips. I use them for this podcast. It's a time saver. Check them out, Opus Clip. And if you're interested in sponsoring or partnering with Dave's Head, reach out and we can make it happen. Lastly, this season, I said I'm going to leave you with a quote to cap each episode. I think for many reasons, this is not only appropriate for who the author of the quote is, but for the times and the way we talk about the people in this country, the people that come to this country, the politics all around it, and so much more. Jimmy Carter turned 100 years old earlier this year, I think a month or two ago. And he made a declaration that he wanted to live long enough to cast his vote for the person he wanted to vote for, who was Kamala Harris. And he did that last week, I believe. And so this quote is from Jimmy Carter. It's, "We become not a melting pot, but a beautiful mosaic. Different people, different beliefs, different yearnings, different hopes, different dreams." And so as Jimmy celebrates and continues, every single day is a celebration, I assume, living in his 100th year, one of the greatest presidents and greatest give backs people. That's a really bad way to put it, but he gives back to so many people through the Habitat for Humanity and so many different organizations. And so we celebrate him in a way by featuring a quote that I hope resonates with you, and especially in this day and time with the rhetoric around immigration and the talk about people in general. This is supposed to be a melting pot country. And with melting pots, all the ingredients come together to make what should be the best possible combination. And so we shouldn't look at the very, very high quality and the very, very low quality in different ways. We should look at it all as the end result being something amazing. And I don't think we're there today. I think we've gotten away from that. We're demonizing different people because we consider them lower than others. And hopefully we can get away from that at some point, because we're all humans. We all bleed the same way. We all pump the same blood. We all live and die. And so until we stop treating people differently based on their circumstances, we're going to fall way, way short of being a quality melting pot. So thank you, Jimmy Carter, for that quote. So resourcefulness, understanding, and emotional intelligence. All great reasons to be in love with now. That's all for this episode of Dave's Head. New episodes released on the second and fourth Friday of the month. For all things Dave's Head, check out our website at daveshead.card with 2 R's.co. Subscribe to watch new episodes on YouTube or Spotify video, or to listen via your preferred podcast player, go to anchor.fm/Dave Said Pod. Thank you for watching or listening. As always, enjoy life, because life should be fun. Take care.